Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to the panel. I'm sure you've all been waiting for. I know I have. I'm Michael Bennon. I work for the Global Project Center at Stanford University, and I have the honor of being here with this great panel in part because we recently launched a new research initiative on deferred maintenance, accounting, and causes for state and local governments. We're an interdisciplinary research center on infrastructure, finance, and development. And so I have the honor today of learning from some folks that have already completed some research initiatives on this sector. I'll just introduce our panel briefly. At the far end here, Beverly Bunch. She's the professor of public administration and at the Center for State Policy and Leadership at the University of Illinois. Matt Fabian, he's a partner at Municipal Market Analytics. Ron Fisher, he's a professor of economics at Michigan State University. Mary Murphy, she's the project director for fiscal policy project at Pew Charitable Trusts. And then Jerry Zhao here, he's the director of the Institute for Urban and Regional Infrastructure Finance at the University of Minnesota. So I'm pleased to be here and joining the panel, and hopefully I'll be able to talk a little bit about my research as we get to the Q&A. But Jerry, I think I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Yep. Thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for sticking around. And it's really nice to be part of this panel on deferred maintenance. And since I'm the first one to speak, I think I get the chance to explain the concept a little bit. Deferred maintenance is technically defined as the part of maintenance that was not performed and thus were delayed for a future period. And I want to mention that deferred maintenance is actually a subset of infrastructure needs, because infrastructure needs could include things that we want to do, like new or additional capacity, those things. And since early last year, we, a research team inside the Humphrey School, have been working together with the Volcker Alliance on a project looking at the transparency in state capital budgeting. We look at the processes of state capital budgeting. We look at documentations, not only the budget, but also related documentations about capital budgeting. Then we dig deeper into deferred maintenance and also capital needs in state improvement plans. And I would only briefly talk about the findings here, where overall I would say the overall picture is a little saddening. Many would agree that in this country we may have a big gap for infrastructure spending, but I think nobody will be able to tell how big that gap actually is, because there are a lot of in many parts the potholes are still hidden. And the deferred maintenance reporting overall is really inconsistent, incomplete, and not quite systematic in the ways that they are calculated and also in the ways that they are presented. Later on, I can provide some details if we have time. But to sum up I think those issues right now, it's less a technical issue about how we measure them, technically or professionally. It's more a management issue. It's really the time to establish some kind of regular practice to require states to have those reported, and before that, well, we are able to talk about how we may make improvements. So it's an issue of transparency from a government perspective. It's awareness from the public perspective. Yesterday, I remember that John and I had some good discussion about how a higher level of transparency can promote public engagement. And well, higher level of awareness, the public or maybe the media could also be helpful. They can promote the government to get more transparent. Those two really feed into each other. So those are my beginning thoughts.
So maybe what we can do, so we have a bit of a story here because we have, I think, a panel that's approached this from multiple angles. Beverly, maybe you could go next because I think you've done some research on how funding's managed for infrastructure and some comparisons across states.
Sure. As part of the Volcker Truth and Integrity in State Budgeting Study, we were asked to look at deferred maintenance in some states, and I just want to share with you some of the big states. One, we looked at New York State, and of course the first place we looked was their capital program and finance plan. It's a huge, very comprehensive, in many ways, a very impressive document, but there was nothing on deferred maintenance. Then we moved to Illinois. Illinois has a much smaller document called a capital plan. there was a whole section on deferred maintenance, focusing primarily on facilities, but they also did higher education. Where did these numbers come from? Well, facilities, the agencies prepared them. Higher ed, looks like higher ed requested money in the budget document, but they were really low. And to be quite frank, I think higher ed was discouraged not having a budget for several years that they come in with low requests because they don't expect to have much funding. And then they also did look at K through 12, which is interesting, again, relying in this case on survey data. We did get a little more excited when we looked at the state of Texas. In 2015, Texas passed legislation that created a legislative oversight committee. And this wakes up the agencies. The agencies go to hearings. There's a 2.5-hour hearing where they talk about their needs. And then TxDOT, Texas Department of Transportation, embarks on a whole new process to estimate their facility needs. Why? Because the legislators care and they're listening. The other thing Volcker asked us to look at were transfers, and one in particular might have impact on maintenance, and that is fund sweeps, where the state moves money from a designated fund to the general fund. And I hate to pick on Kansas and Illinois, but I'm going to have to. Kansas transferred in 2013 from the highway fund to the general fund was $110 million. By 2017, it had increased to $500 million. And it's continued even after the tax increase at that level. At the same time, they were issuing highway bonds and deferring the first principal payment until 2025. Does this impact maintenance? Empirical question. Illinois, 2015, the year before our budget impasse, transferred $250 million in a fund sweep to the general fund. The next year, Illinois' interest groups lobbied and got passed a constitutional lockbox. And you're probably familiar with that. That's when they restrict the transportation taxes and fees to be used only for transportation. It passed with 80% of the voter approval. California also passed one this year. Connecticut has one on the ballot in November. So again, what is the impact of transfers and lockboxes on maintenance? And I think that's an empirical question. Hopefully research will address soon.
So, Mary, I think at Pew, you've been doing some recent work. I know it's not published yet, but on specifically asset inventories, which is also overlaps with some of the work that we want to do at my center. And it's kind of a promising but very new kind of phase of this. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the work that you guys have been doing on this.
Sure, and I think Pew's work builds on and intersects really nicely with some of the things that Jerry and Beverly have already touched on. And I should say that the research that we've been doing really focuses specifically on vertical infrastructure, by which I mean state-owned buildings. That obviously varies a little bit state to state, whether that includes things like prisons and schools, but in every state we're talking about state-owned office buildings, capital complexes, any building or facility owned and maintained by the state. And as we were looking at all 50 states and asking some very sort of basic questions about the extent to which states are required by statute to report the deferred maintenance on these facilities, and absent any requirements, do they just happen to be doing it anyway? And I think it won't be surprising for you to hear that a lot of what we were hearing in talking to folks in the states was we're really struggling to make progress in this area. And that's not to say that a lot of folks in the states don't recognize the importance of collecting this data. They're facing challenges sort of common to the themes that we've been talking about all day, namely resource constraints. How do you elevate the importance of investing in the maintenance, and particularly in the deferred maintenance backlog on these assets when these are often sort of invisible liabilities. So we were curious about the asset inventory question in particular. To what extent can states tell us, do they have a comprehensive asset inventory? Can they report out on everything that they actually own and are responsible for maintaining? A minority of states told us that they could do that just across the buildings that the state owns and operates. And then the second piece we were really curious about was the conditions assessment. So you need sort of both pieces of data if you're going to start really measuring your deferred maintenance backlog and develop a strategy for addressing it. You need to know how much you're responsible for, and then think about how you're going to prioritize those investments strategically. particularly on the conditions assessment side, where that data, you can't just do it one time. These are things you need to be doing on a regular basis. This data has to be dynamic. You have to have a process for making sure that you're revisiting your facilities whenever there's a disruptive event like a hurricane. To that example, the state of Louisiana told us that they had done a conditions assessment, a very comprehensive one, but it was before Hurricane Katrina. So a lot of those buildings not only aren't operational anymore, they don't exist, let alone setting aside the changes in the conditions of those buildings. So the general theme was a lot of challenges making progress in collecting this data. One other thing I just want to note here is that even the states that had made a lot of progress in developing comprehensive asset inventories and putting in place some process to evaluate the conditions of those assets on a regular basis, figuring out how to assemble the data that you're collecting from independent agencies, and you touched on this a little bit as well, and turn that into something that a state policymaker can use to really prioritize investments with limited resources is a challenging endeavor for most of the states that we talk to. A couple of optimistic stories I will point to, just so our panel isn't all sort of doom and gloom. They've gotten a lot of attention, deservedly today, but the state of Utah has made significant progress, notably over a long period of time. We heard from folks in Utah that this took really the better part of a decade to think about how to really get a handle on the state's full asset portfolio. They've also codified a process to dedicate maintenance funds to any newly approved capital project. So I think that's a very notable example for other states to take note of. The state of Minnesota recently made a significant one-time appropriation in an effort to build a comprehensive asset inventory. They're also going a step further so that the centralized agency that's responsible for that inventory will train staff in every state agency to make sure that they are building apples to apples comparisons when staff go out and assess the condition of those assets. And then the last one I'll point to is the state of Wyoming, which already had a process in place for regularly evaluating all of their K-12 buildings. They were doing it every 4 years on a rolling basis, and they're starting to expand that to all of their state-owned buildings. So there are some promising examples out there in the states when it comes to trying to measure and evaluate their capital assets.
Very, very different, I think, than, well, California is one of the standouts here. I know, being a citizen, in that they have a state deferred maintenance inventory for a couple of years now, and I think they found around 50 billion or something like that the first round, and then Governor Brown allocated a couple $1 billion to actually pay down deferred maintenance and had them re-report the next year, and they found another $20 billion, I think. So when the money came, they found more. Maybe there should be a standard accounting system for this. Matt, I know you've looked at the modified approach with GASB and seen how some of the accounting across different municipalities works.
Sure, thank you. And actually, your point. I tend to think that that the deferred maintenance issue in America, at the states and more importantly at the local governments, is less something about funding, more about transparency. Because where the numbers are revealed, just like pensions, right? We're talking about different and customized pension solutions, state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, because of transparency, right? There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Same would be the case with deferred maintenance. There were a couple attempts. I'd say one actual attempt and one sort of potential attempt that was missed. GASB 34, just over 20 years ago, came out, and it was created in response to issuers or local governments' lack of patience with amortization or the historical way that through depreciation that they've accounted for maintenance. They were offered an option through GASB rules to instead switch to what's called the modified approach, where they could put all of their assets, have an asset management system set up. They would take a census of their facilities and integrate it into these. These things actually exist. These asset management systems where you could look at how many miles of roads and how many square feet of buildings and such are in your jurisdiction, under your control, and what is the current state of repair And so just say your roads are at 50% of perfect, right? You would have a pretty good idea, because the data is linked up with actual vendors, to say, well, what will be the actual cost of going from 50% repair to 60% repair? And you could see that number, right? And it would be reasonably, so that was a potential, but issuers, given this choice of much more transparency, even though it got away from sort of the reviled depreciation system, it was worse. So they didn't use it, and almost no issuers moved to it. Some state DOTs do, but generally few others. The other option that, or alternative that had come up and was pushed, maybe just by me, but I tried really hard. I thought it was a good idea. When ARRA was being discussed, right, when there were billions of dollars to be given out in the cause of infrastructure, right, I sort of took this case to Washington and said, here, instead of spending the money on this ridiculous and very expensive Build America bond program, which in the best case just accelerated some bond issues by 18 months or 12 months at a much higher expense to the federal government, why not instead fund an infrastructure census, right? And give money, hire workers all across America to put together a catalog of infrastructure, and that would create transparency, and then solutions would follow. But no one listened. Actually, a couple of years after that, I was in a meeting with Treasury Secretary Lew, who, it was a roundtable discussion about infrastructure solutions, and I posed this, and he said, actually put his right in my face, no, actually everyone knows where the potholes are. I'm like, that's really the problem, but they don't. So, I mean, one of the problems with infrastructure maintenance, I'll try to be quick, but is that different than pensions, right? Because there is virtue in not funding your pensions. It's not the best course, but there is some upside in not funding your pensions, in that there is less money to be poached, right? If you are running a lean and underfunded pension system, your total expense towards pensions and employee compensation might be less than if you had a 100% funded pension. And, because no one really thinks about the kind of benefits being allocated by governments with 100% funded pensions. So there's some virtue. On the deferred maintenance side, there is a cost, right? If you let your maintenance erode, it's a tax on the people that are using the infrastructure. Your cars have to be realigned every, a year earlier than otherwise, or you need new tires, or, maybe your water is poisonous, right? There are people who pay for the lack of, so this is a smaller issue than pensions, almost surely, but yet something that we pay for even if we don't fix it.
And I guess speaking of paying for it, I think, Ron, your recent study, I think, was slightly different, because it was about how to kind of raise funding for these, or what the perceptions of that is by citizens.
Yeah, thank you. So the great thing about being the last panel speaker is that everyone expects me to be brief, and I will, but it also is an opportunity to connect back to some of the key points that Professor Inman made this morning in his introductory keynote remarks. So let's suppose that states and local governments properly measure fiscal health and properly measure infrastructure needs. How to solve the problems that are identified by those measurements? Well, it obviously requires a fiscal proposal, and the fiscal proposal is going to require both political and popular support in order for it to go forward. And research suggests that there are two serious perception problems that block those kinds of proposals going forward. First, there's a lot of evidence now that individual taxpayers overestimate the cost that they have to pay in taxes or fees. So research some of my colleagues and I have done, people overestimate how much they pay in gasoline excise taxes. They overestimate how much they would pay in vehicle mileage fees. People overestimate how much they pay in property taxes, which seems remarkably surprising, because most people pay a property tax bill twice a year, but they still don't know how much they pay. There's other research, including by a couple of my colleagues at Michigan State, suggesting that people overestimate what their income tax rates are. So if people overestimate these tax and fee costs, they think the price of solving infrastructure problems or solving fiscal problems is higher than it actually is. The second perception problem I think exists is that many individuals, I think, underestimate the cost or the magnitude or what's involved in fixing infrastructure problems or dealing with services that are heavily dependent on infrastructure. I think people think when you say to citizens, well, we have a problem that's going to require $500 million to solve this problem. People say, $500 million? Are you kidding me? That's ridiculously expensive. And I play a game with some of my graduate public policy students. I ask them, how much does it cost for a mile of interstate limited access road? They have no idea. It is in urban areas these days about $10 million a mile. So if you drive 10 miles on one of those kinds of roads to work every day, you are using a $100 million asset twice a day. And of course, the other example of this is from my own state, the problem of clean and healthy water. I can't think of any other public service that people take more for granted. We wake up in the morning, brush our teeth, take a shower, have a cup of coffee, and we just assume that the water is going to flow and it's going to be fine. And nobody knows what's involved in the process of making that happen. And therefore, how much it would cost to resolve problems in those kinds of processes. So I think people underestimate the cost of solving these problems. So if people overestimate how much they have to pay, they think the price is too high, and they underestimate the cost, they think it's ridiculous how much government is proposing to solve this problem, you have a natural conflict that leads to inaction, the inability to solve these kinds of problems. So even if we can measure them all properly, even if we can measure fiscal wealth, even if we can measure infrastructure needs, how are we going to develop the kind of popular support for proposals to solve these problems? I think it requires an education effort on the part of government officials, on the part of non-governmental organizations, many of whom are represented here, on the part of academics, so that people understand better what the real cost to them, what the real costs to them are, and what the real expenses are to solve these kinds of problems.
So I think John Oliver did a segment on U.S. infrastructure a few years ago, and his solution was to have Ed Norton do some movies about infrastructure maintenance to bring up citizen awareness of. I don't know if I agree with that that solution, but I guess so. I had a couple, and I think we'll have a little bit of time for some questions from the audience. But I had a couple for the panel. I guess the first one is on this awareness issue. So of course, citizens need to be more aware of infrastructure and allocate funding to it. And I think some of the metrics that we talked about could incentivize that. It occurs to me that there's two other potential that come to mind, constituencies that could affect this issue. One would be the federal government in terms of state and local accountability for infrastructure. And the second one would be the ratings agencies or bondholders could solve this issue. I guess my first question, if anyone on the panel had thoughts in terms of getting the feds to be a productive participant in terms of state and local governments dealing with their infrastructure issues. I mean, I think, so 2016, an interesting figure, was a great year for infrastructure in the U.S. because we funded $230 billion of infrastructure in 2016, all state and local initiatives, state and local ballot initiatives. And so it occurs that kind of as the federal government, which hadn't passed a lot of infrastructure spending recently, recedes, some state and local leaders are stepping up. Are there other ways that the federal government can, I mean, I think a census is a great potential idea, but are there other ways the feds can do that?
But we kind of shot that. I mean, we're not going to have billions of dollars. You know, going forward, I think the best we can hope for is the federal government not to make things much, much worse. You know, they're going to make it much worse, right? It's been the long-term budget, Republican or Democrat, whatever you are, the long-term budget deficit is enormous at the federal level, and it suggests, you know, massive cuts to state aid. And the states are going to downstream cuts to local governments. And so, you know, there's going to be differential responses at the local level. Some will raise taxes to pay for things like schools and infrastructure, and some will not, right? So, you know, the federal government in theory could help, you know, is an ameliorating factor there. but expecting something more out of that, I think this is much more of a go in your own way as states. We at MMA we talk a lot about divergent outcomes. Local governments as our subscribers are investors and bond dealers, and so there have been very few defaults. The current default rate among GO bonds is 0.01%. So what is that? 0.01% of GO bonds are currently in default. So how do you show much? But going forward, that's a very homogeneous outcome. Going forward, likely not so much because of the pressures that really start at the top.
There was a study that looked at, after Gatsby 34, the impact in the secondary bond market on spread and interest rates. And they looked at the states that were doing modified, that at that time were about 20 versus the ones doing traditional. And they found there was a little tighter, the difference in terms of the bond prices for the states that were doing modified, which suggests that perhaps investors did recognize, or perhaps it's correlated more if those are the states that more likely are doing asset management plans, which now under MAP through the Federal Transportation Act are required, but a number of states were already doing them in the 90s. So I don't know if people hear about these studies, academics we do, but the more states see concrete results that, yeah, we could get a better interest rate, or the feds are going to threaten to withhold our money if we don't do this, then those are incentives or disincentives that speak to people.
Mike, this is a point that's been made many times before by people besides me, but there's not much of a platform currently for the subnational government sector and the federal government sector to interact and to talk about policy discussions. There once was, of course. The Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations once existed. I think for some years it was an effective platform. It went away. There have been talk about resurrecting it, but not really any serious opportunities there. But I think some kind of mechanism for outside of the traditional day-to-day political discussions to have an opportunity for federal and subnational government officials to interact on these things could be helpful.
Mm-hmm. To add a little bit to this comment about federal and state role, I would actually echo Matt's point that it would be helpful that the federal government can contribute more, but in structure, ultimately, I think it will be state and local responsibility. They are hard decisions to be made by state and local governments. Like even taken highway system or road system as one example, a lot of people assume federal fuel tax will be a key part, but actually local money is several times higher than federal money. And many other infrastructure are indeed mostly local. And we can talk about funding, we can talk about financing. There are many ways of doing things, but ultimately, I think right now the limitation of on state and local governments, they are not borrowing enough, not taking enough advantage of the low interest rate. It's still on funding because those infrastructure money, if you finance, that should still be paid back by infrastructure funding. So ultimately, I think as well, state and local governments, if public collectively acknowledge the value of infrastructure, then that's the decision to approve tax and fees to support those things.
And if I can add one final point to this, I think keeping in mind the difference in the federal role and the potential for federal leadership and influence sort of across classes of assets is important to keep in mind, where the role for the feds on highway transportation related infrastructure is obviously very different than like the buildings example that I was talking about. And so where there's an opportunity for the feds to play a larger role, I think will sort of vary across the asset classes you're looking at. One thing I think was really interesting that came up in our research was the role of states actually in defining even just what deferred maintenance means. You opened with sort of the big picture, I think generally accepted definition of deferred maintenance, but states are certainly using all kinds of different definitions when they're trying to catalog their own deferred maintenance needs.
If I could just make one more quick point, because muni bonds were mentioned, and I feel the need to talk more just briefly about that. But just the idea of investor discipline is also an increasingly obsolete idea. Just, there's a lot of reasons. It's not just that interest rates are low and that there's a low supply of new bonds coming to market. There's a lot of technical and structural and probably permanent reasons why municipal investors will be less able to differentiate between well-run governments and poorly run governments. So, I've described the muni bond market as the captive finance arm of the state and local governments, and that's really the case going forward. So, looking for investors to discipline governments is, really a waiting for Godot kind of experience. It needs to come from, I don't know where, but from somewhere else besides the investor side.
So we can take some questions from the audience. I mean, I've got plenty. Yeah, Bill, go ahead.
Well, this actually comes off of what Matt just said. Not that long ago, New Jersey, Kansas, Illinois, San Diego, and I'm not sure who else, got sanctioned by the SEC for not telling the full truth, not necessarily lying, but not telling the full truth about their pension liabilities. So, right, exactly. So, but they all got into trouble, and they weren't ordered to fix the pensions. They were just ordered to report better. So are we ever going to get to the stage where the SEC says, you're selling these road bonds, or you're selling these, your University of Illinois is selling a bond for new classroom buildings. You're not telling the full truth about how crappy those buildings really are. So does this come from the SEC?
I mean, there needs to be a rule. There would need to be a rule at the federal level that would define a standard that the governments would then violate, and then the SEC would then hear about and look to enforce. So the SEC they clean things up. They don't set policy. So there would need to be movement in Congress, probably, or at least at some federal rulemaking board for that to happen.
Again, another question.
So I wanted to ask about sort of a marginal case, admittedly, but you all were talking about the difficulty in raising revenue for deferred maintenance and sort of the public misperception of costs and taxation. So I'm thinking maybe there's some other creative ways we could try to fund these. And what springs to mind is Domino's has been filling pothole locations, like 200 locations across the U.S. They're doing it with branded logos. There's a gubernatorial candidate in New York who has proposed leasing naming rights for particular bridges and roadways, and then making them the company who buys the naming rights in charge of deferred maintenance costs for that infrastructure. And I just wanted to see what you all thought about sort of these creative or innovative ways of trying to fund public goods.
Well, Domino's is engaging in advertising, and that's wonderful for Domino's. The naming rights thing is very interesting. I actually wrote about that 2 years ago, and I heard from a number of people around the country in some states that I singled out as possibilities, telling me that I was absolutely crazy, and that they were never going to allow the sale of names on popular public projects. Or even so, the names, and we know that we've seen both the advantages and disadvantages of that in the sports world. So it works both ways. So I think there are creative things that can be done, but we haven't seen, for example, some industries, the Domino's case notwithstanding, step forward to help solve the problem. So where's the freight industry, the trucking industry? Hasn't really been there.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, please.
I'd be more interested in some of the more mundane pricing. For example, some states have facility fees that include both a maintenance and a replacement option. Or public-private partnerships often include maintenance provisions. And I know in Texas, public tolling authorities can enter into something that looks like a public-private partnership, and then they too would be held to the maintenance.
Yeah, no, yeah, and public-private partnerships, or P3s, have gotten a lot of focus in Washington. I'd say probably to the detriment of actually funding infrastructure. But there have been some successful, like we talked about here, but also on a much smaller scale, it's very common for governments to engage in a light bulb swap, where a private company puts in LEDs, pays the cost up front, and then gets paid out of the savings in the electric bill. I mean, that happens all the time. There are people who specialize in it, but it's super small compared to what needs to be done.
And I mean, I would just add, in my estimation, I would say one of the largest potential actual funding sources for infrastructure that's untapped is land value capture. And there's a whole lot of opportunities, especially in the United States, that don't take advantage of that. That'd be another potential source. Yeah, another question.
Hi, Jason Horowitz with Anderson Economic Group. I've noticed, at least anecdotally, governments often will cut corners a bit up front and resulting in more costly maintenance, a few years down the road. So say, maybe we could have spent 25% more on surfacing this road, and that would have required us to spend half as much 10 years from now on replacing it. Are you guys aware of like a good strategy or a good way of accounting for that future maintenance to actually encourage governments to make that upfront investment, even if it's maybe a little bit more, because it's a smarter investment down the road?
Among the engineers that I interact frequently, I think there are quite some anecdotal stories like that. But the sad news, it's hard to find out systematic data of how big that things happen, like making insufficient maintenance lead to big costs in the future. Those are things that we'd like to dig in much deeper. But in terms of solution, I think thinking about the typical budget cycle we have, it's 1 year or 2 years, and the typical election cycle is 4 years. And so the system itself will not provide enough incentives to have those long-term considerations. So there has to be additional mechanisms to be built in, maybe through GASB or through the promotion of like Volcker Alliance or other foundations, just to push those things forward.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, please, I've already talked a lot, so.
Well, I was just going to say, in addition to that point, I think when we talk to state facilities administrators, for example, they highlight the challenges in trying to communicate to their state legislatures or executive budget offices, just the cost of sort of the compounding cost of deferring maintenance in any given year, and sort of forcing consideration of that as a growing debt. So not only am I not aware of strategies to address what you're talking about, I think even just sort of how you think about the calculation on those accumulating maintenance issues is a challenge a lot of states are trying to figure out how to address.
I also think engaging engineers is important. There was a study out of George Mason University where they interviewed both finance people and transportation people, and a lot of times they view these things very differently. And there was a group of students working under a professor, and they concluded you need to get these groups together. I mean, engineers have a lot of expertise in terms of those cost-benefit trade-offs, and if they're asked and provided a platform for making the trade-offs, it would be more helpful than just saying this is how much we have to work, go do it.
But it is a classic government trade-off. That's why we have the pension crisis that we do, right? If government could pay teachers upfront in salary an acceptable wage, right, that the unions would agree on, there wouldn't need to be backloaded compensation through pensions, right, sort of hidden. If they had the political infrastructure to raise taxes enough upfront to pay that, I mean, if you think about pensions long-term, the solution may well be just pay teachers more upfront, buy them out of the need for pensions in the long term. And that's sort of the same thing we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the similar model for infrastructure is just a life cycle procurement. P3, the same contractor that builds it has to maintain it for 20 years, right? So they have to optimize for that, and that works, but that's another tough issue because the government has to account for all those costs in procurement now, which isn't always as easy. We're a little over time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah.
Can you use the microphone, please?
I thought I was. How much do you, Sheila Weinberg, Truth in Accounting, how much do you think public cynicism prevents taxpayers' willingness to fund infrastructure, that they don't trust their elected officials, they don't think that the government's run very well? How much do you think that adversely affects this issue?
I personally like to take it in a more neutral way. The way I would say is that in this country, it seems that we don't have the sufficient political will to invest, but that could be in part explained by the fact that we still don't have good evidence about what are the benefits and how benefits are allocated. So from researchers' part, we see it as responsibility that we should do more and we can do more to illustrate the value and to communicate that value.
Any other questions? No? Oh, yep, one last one.
Question. I'm Denise Applebaum, Montclair State University in New Jersey. And I guess my question goes more towards the cost of these projects to maintain or to inspect the asset. Bridges are one of the most costly inspection to conduct, and every state has to conduct it. And my understanding is that drones, for example, you can realize a 65% savings of the cost of a bridge inspection with drones. So why aren't we looking more on the cost side of the equation, not always looking to raise more revenue and funding?
Well, I mean, people are, I mean, you know, I know that in New York City, I'm not an expert in New York City building codes and things, but that like every brick of a building for a brick building has to be inspected every few years, like every brick. And so it used to be you'd have a, you know, scaffolding up, right? And there were, you know, business empires built around the scaffolding business. And now they have drones that just go brick to brick and look at them all. So there's no reason you couldn't have, I mean, especially when you compare it to like, what's the cost of having a closed bridge? You have to, like, everybody has to drive around for months, right? That's ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, there's a bridge right by my house. When it closes, what a pain in the butt. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, I would maybe add, I don't know about the specific example you mentioned, but just code changes is usually where there's lag and more cost-efficient maintenance adoption and infrastructure, because it's all code-based and it just takes some time to update those. So that's a problem as well, for sure. Well, I know we went a little bit over, but we started late. But you know, please join me in thanking my last panelist.
So we can't count on those investors, darn it.
Out in the break room. This is a very brief thank you to you all, and I hope Rick will come up here for a second. It's been a great day. We've learned a tremendous amount. I appreciate your cooperation and your understanding and your participation. Thank you again to everybody from the Volcker Alliance and Chicago Fed and for this beautiful facility, and to our partners at Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, Chicago Fed, of course, the Pew, and have a safe and wonderful trip home, whether you're going down the street or across the country.